Hello, it's Monday. That means another time for another episode of Run Talk from our studios in Southern California. This is Run Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. On today's show, we're going to talk about, again, we're going to go with the theme of what we've been talking about last week. We're going to talk about a different strategy of training. And so today is all about training with low glycogen, low muscle glycogen. Carbohydrates gets a bad rap. It's in our society. People think that carbs are like poison. You got to stay away from it. But the scientific community has known since the 1960s that carbohydrate is the muscle's preferred fuel during exercise. Even moderate intensity exercise, you use more carbohydrate than you do fat. And so there are some strategies that you can employ if you're training for long races, like a marathon. And there are some strategies that you can employ to increase the amount of carbohydrate that you have in your muscles. We've also known since the 1960s that not only is carbohydrate the muscle's preferred fuel during exercise, but that prolonged exercise depletes muscle glycogen, or at least severely lowers muscle glycogen. And that if you do endurance exercise for long periods of time, prolonged exercise, that you can actually stimulate the synthesis of more carbohydrate in your muscles. And the reason that happens is quite interesting. Because muscles rely so much on carbohydrate, because it is the preferred fuel, that any situation that threatens the depletion of that fuel sends a very strong signal to adapt. And the way the muscles adapt is by synthesizing and storing more carbohydrate for the future so that you improve your endurance for the future. It's a very elegant system that we have. And that the fact that we do that shows how important carbohydrate is to the muscles. That if you run long enough or do some other kind of endurance exercise where you severely lower the amount of carbohydrate fuel that you have, then your muscles will actually they're stimulated to actually synthesize more. So you can think of it, I always use the funny analogy. I think of when you go to, back in the day when we go to cocktail parties, think about when you go to a cocktail party and you're given a glass of wine, and you drink the glass of wine, you empty your glass. Imagine if in replacement of that empty glass, you get a larger refilled glass. That's exactly what your muscles do. In response to lowering this very important fuel tank, our muscles will respond by making a bigger fuel tank. And that's what you want to have when you go to the starting line of a long race. Like when you go to the starting line of a marathon, you want to be as glycogen full as you possibly can be. You want glycogen to be coming out of every pore of your body, because muscle glycogen is your jet fuel. That is what's going to help you maintain the pace of the entire marathon. And so there are some strategies that you can employ during training in order to increase your fuel store and to increase the muscle glycogen. And so that gets us into today's topic of low glycogen training. And just in case, probably should give some definitions, just in case you don't know what muscle glycogen is. So everybody knows they have sugar in their blood. You have glucose hanging around in your blood. You have glucose molecules in your blood. Every diabetic is very familiar with glucose in their blood. They're always checking their blood glucose level. If you take a bunch of glucose molecules and you string them together and branch them out like a tree branch, so it looks like an elegant tree branch. So you have a string of glucose molecules in a row, and then they're branched out like a tree branch. That's what muscle glycogen is. So that's the way we store glucose is in this branched chain of glucose molecules called glycogen. And when we break down that glycogen for fuel, that's a process called glycogenolysis. So glycogenolysis is the breaking down of glycogen into glucose. And then the breaking down of glucose into pyruvate and ATP for energy, that's glycolysis. So glycolysis and glycogenolysis work together. We can either use glycolysis just to use the glucose in the blood, or if we break down glycogen, then we start with glycogenolysis, which is I think it's 3 chemical reactions that get us from glycogen to glucose. And then once we're at glucose, Then we go through the 9 steps of glycolysis to give us pyruvate and ATP. So that's just a quick biochemistry lesson, just in case you didn't know how glycogen is broken down. There are actually enzymes that come in and take that tree branch and break it down into its constituents. So we have enzymes that actually break down the glycogen into glucose, into the individual components, the glucose molecules. And then glucose is broken down further by glycolysis. So glycogenolysis, glycolysis work together, work in concert with one another. So I don't want to keep digressing. Let's get back to the point. I digress a lot. I go on side roads. I think about something I want to say, and then I say, there are no cue cards here. I've said that before. No cue cards on RUNTALK. I just talk. So how do you train, then, to maximize how much glycogen you have in your skeletal muscles? There are a few things that you can do. You see a lot of runners these days wearing fuel belts when they go on long runs, and that actually will blunt the adaptations that are made. Because remember what I just said before, the goal is to get to the start line of a marathon with as glycogen fuel tank, with as large of a glycogen fuel tank as possible. And the way to make a bigger fuel tank is to empty the tank. So one of the reasons why marathon runners run long every weekend is to deplete their fuel tank. And so if you always run these long runs taking in fuel, if you're wearing a fuel belt, or if you just take in carbohydrate from the outside, then that is blunting the adaptations that you want to cause. And so it's better, at least sometimes, to not take in carbohydrate. The 3 major adaptations that you want to cause that are blunted is that, number 1, what I just said before, that when you run out of carbohydrate, that sends a very strong signal to stimulate the synthesis of more carbohydrate, and you have a greater glycogen fuel tank. The second is that you rely on fat. When the carbohydrate fuel tank is empty, then the muscles will have to necessarily start to rely on fat because there's no carbohydrate left. And so the muscles become better. They become more effective at relying on fatty acids for energy. But if you keep taking in carbohydrate from the outside as you're running, then you never get to the point where you're completely carbohydrate depleted and your muscles never are forced to rely on fat. And in the marathon itself, unless you're the best in the world and you have enough stored carbohydrate to last the length of the race, most people don't, then you're not going to get as much out of that as possible. You're never going to teach the muscles to be able to rely on fat. And so they're never going to learn how to do that. And that's why when you start to rely on fat, the pace falls off, because you can't maintain as fast of a pace relying on fat as you can on carbohydrate. You want to be relying on carbohydrate for the entire marathon. And so the way to do that in training, you get to the point where you deplete the tank and the muscles are forced to rely on fat and become better at using fat to regenerate energy so that you can continue to run at the pace that you want to run. So that's the second reason. The third reason is something very interesting that what your liver does in response to sensing a low glycogen fuel tank. Your liver, when it senses that the glycogen fuel tank is very low or depleted, it will take some things that are not carbohydrate, because there's no carbohydrate left. It'll take some other things, and it'll turn it into carbohydrate. Namely, it takes amino acids from protein breakdown, and it takes lactate. So whatever lactate is available, take the lactate, take amino acids, and it will convert those things into more glycogen, into more glucose. And that's called gluconeogenesis. We've given a fancy term, neo meaning new, like a neonate baby, new baby. So neo meaning new, and genesis, the formation of, the creation of, comes from the Bible, Genesis, the book of Genesis. So you put the terms together and you find out what it is. So gluconeogenesis, the formation of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, amino acids and lactate. And so again, if you're taking carbohydrate during these long runs, then you never get to a point where you deplete the tank. And then your liver can just go on vacation. It could just sit there and say, well, I don't need to do my job. I don't need to become better at gluconeogenesis because this person is taking carbohydrate from the outside. So there's no reason why I need to do my job. So you blunt those 3 adaptations. The fact that the liver does that is so elegant. Imagine if your car did that. Imagine if you're driving down the highway until your gas tank gets empty, and in response to that, some part of your car, let's say the battery is your liver, say the battery of the car recognizes that the gas tank is getting empty, and it takes another part of the car, let's say the back seat, and it turns the back seat into more gasoline so that you could keep driving at the speed that you want to drive. That's what your liver does. How cool is that? That's really cool, Jason. Oh, I'm glad you think so. That's what your liver does in response to a low carbohydrate fuel tank. How elegant is that? What an elegant adaptation from evolution. Again, this shows us that when you deplete the carbohydrate fuel tank that is so threatening to the muscle's survival, that we have a mechanism to make more glucose in response to that threat. And so your liver is very, very smart. And in response to that threat of a low carbohydrate fuel tank, it will take amino acids and lactate and turn those things into more gasoline, more carbohydrate, more glucose. And so on your long runs, if you're interested in trying to maximize these adaptations, then it's better to not run when taking in carbohydrate. You don't want to take in carbohydrate during the long run. Now, having said that, you never want to do something different in the marathon that you haven't done in training. And so, because in the marathon itself, you do want to take carbohydrate because you want to keep your blood glucose elevated for as long as possible so that you can maintain the pace that you're trying to hold, then you have to practice that. Because if you never take carbohydrate on long runs, and now all of a sudden you take it in the marathon, you're going to get a lot of gastrointestinal distress. You'll be spending the second half of the race in the porta potties that line the course. You don't want to do that. I wonder what people are doing now with all these virtual marathons that they're running. Are they putting porta potties on their virtual marathon course around their neighborhood? How do they go to the bathroom if they have to go to the bathroom? Hopefully they don't have to go to the bathroom. You don't want to have to go to the bathroom during a marathon, but people end up having to do this. I wonder what's going on now with all these virtual marathons. But I digress again. So at least some of your long runs, to force these physiological adaptations to be made, don't run with taking in carbohydrate. Maximize the drainage of the glycogen fuel tank, and so that you get the adaptations that are in response to that, those three adaptations. There's more to low glycogen training. There's actually a lot of interest in research to show that when it comes to maximizing the glycogen response and building a bigger fuel tank, training twice every other day is superior to training once every day. So this research is fairly new, and it's not on running, and so it's hard to extrapolate to running. But there's research that's looked at like a leg extension exercise. People sit in a leg extension chair in a machine, and they do leg extension exercise repeatedly until they deplete muscle glycogen. And there's other research on cyclists, and some research out of Australia has been done on cyclists using this method. And what they find is that when you do two workouts separated by not that much time, only an hour or two, where you do research that has shown that you do a long run or a long cycle, a long ride in the morning, and then an hour or two later do an interval workout on the bike. So there's not enough time in between the two workouts to resynthesize carbohydrate. And by really draining the carbohydrate fuel tank, then the next day is a rest day, and then the next day they do the same thing again, twice, two workouts. So they'll do a bike ride, and then 2 hours later they'll do an interval workout on the bike. Then they'll take a rest day, and then they repeat this pattern for a few weeks. And then they compare that to cyclists who alternate the long ride and the interval workout on consecutive days. So do a long ride one day, then the interval workout the next day, then a long ride the next day, then an interval workout the next day. Very interesting research to do 2 workouts on one day, and then a rest day, and then 2 workouts on the next day, compared to alternating the long ride and the interval workout on consecutive days. And in terms of glycogen resynthesis and making a bigger glycogen fuel tank and synthesizing and storing more glycogen, the 2 workouts every other day is superior than 1 workout every day. So very, very interesting research on looking at how to manipulate the training to maximize glycogen resynthesis in the muscle. So there's a few ways you can do this as a runner. You can adopt that strategy, do 2 runs every other day rather than 1 run every day. You can do the things we just talked about during your long runs, not taking in carbohydrate. You can also do back-to-back long runs on the weekend. So, most distance runners who run marathons, especially the recreational, the recreational runners, the millions of recreational runners who run marathons, they'll do this pattern of training, and they get stuck in that pattern, and they'll do one long run every weekend. Another strategy that you can employ to maximize the glycogen fuel tank is by doing back-to-back long runs. So if you're doing Saturday, Sunday, do a Saturday long run, a Sunday long run, and don't eat a lot of carbohydrate in between those two runs. So you go into the Sunday long run on a much lower carbohydrate fuel tank. It's not going to feel good. It's, you're going to feel blah, especially when you're not used to doing it. So you're not going to feel good because you're going into that run on a low glycogen fuel tank. But that's the point. That's how you stimulate the synthesis of more glycogen. So that's another strategy that you can employ, that do back-to-back long runs. If you're not used to doing that, I wouldn't start out by doing a back-to-back 20. You wouldn't do 20 and 20. Start with something less. Start maybe doing a 20 on Saturday and then doing maybe a 14 on Sunday. Or you could reverse it. Do the 14 on Sunday, do a 14 on Saturday, do a 20 on Sunday, and start building it up. When you first start with the marathon training, maybe the runs aren't that long. Maybe you do a 16 on Saturday and a 12 on Sunday, and then start building it up from there. So you add a mile to each of those days, and then by the time toward the end of your marathon training program, you may be at a 20 and a 20, or a 20 and an 18, or an 18 and a 20. So the point is, do back-to-back long runs rather than just do one long run each week. Do back-to-back long runs, and then you give yourself a 2 or 3 days recovery after that because your legs are going to be really tired. So do really hammer yourself with back-to-back long runs on consecutive days, and don't eat a lot of carbohydrate in between. Okay. And then in the subsequent days after that, after those 2 days of back-to-back long runs, then eat a lot of carbohydrate so that you give your body the substrate that it needs to resynthesize and store more carbohydrate. So that's the strategy. 2 long runs back-to-back, not eating a lot of carbohydrate in between, and then after that second long run, then consume a lot of carbohydrate. The other way you can do it is you can also do 2 runs on some days a week. If you don't want to do the 2 a day and then off a day, then 2 days, then off a day, if you don't want to do that, then at least 2 or 3 times a week, run twice a day, and then don't eat a lot of carbohydrate in between. So if you have a few hours in between the 2 runs, just eat protein, eat fat, don't eat a lot of carbohydrate in between. So that the second run in that day, you go into it with a lower carbohydrate fuel tank. So there's a lot of different ways that you can manipulate the amount of carbohydrate, when you're training, to train in this low glycogen state. The research doesn't really show much of a benefit other than that, and the research really hasn't looked at other benefits. Some research looked at the mitochondrial function, adding more mitochondria, and so mitochondrial they look at enzymes to be able to determine the amount of mitochondria. So there is the research I referred to earlier, the leg extension exercise. They not only looked at glycogen, but they also looked at mitochondrial enzyme activity, and they also showed by doing the alternating 2 workouts one day and a rest day, and 2 workouts the next day and then a rest day, they also found increased mitochondrial enzyme activity. So it may also be beneficial for mitochondrial enzyme activity. But in terms of other adaptations, the research really hasn't looked at that. They really have looked at this only in regard to glycogen, because lowering muscle glycogen seems to be a very powerful stimulus for adaptation, which again speaks to the importance of muscle carbohydrate and that fuel tank that we need for modest and intense exercise intensity. So those are some strategies to use to train with a low muscle glycogen. Let me see if there are any questions here. I know I speak a lot of things all at once, and I'm trying to see if I can address questions here. Hi, John. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Fit Mom, Strong Mom. Oh, I love that. I love that title. Fit Mom, Strong Mom. Very good. Hi, everybody. So welcome. If you're just joining us, welcome to RUNTALK. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. Today's show is all about training with low muscle glycogen to maximize the adaptations and synthesize and store more carbohydrate. I will say that this is really only important for people who run long races. If you're training for a mile, if you're training for a 5K, 10K, this isn't so important because you already have plenty of muscle carbohydrate to last the duration of the race. But for long races, for marathons and ultra marathons, this strategy becomes more important because you want to go to the start line with as large of a glycogen fuel tank as possible, because the bigger the fuel tank, then the longer into the race you're going to be able to sustain the pace that you want to hold. And so there are strategies that you can employ to lower and subsequently synthesize more glycogen. Hi, Christopher. Thanks for joining us. So those are some strategies. So just to recap, don't take carbohydrate, at least on some of your long runs, so that you deplete the carbohydrate fuel tank, and in response during recovery you make a bigger fuel tank. Also so that you deplete the tank and you force the muscle to rely more on fat as fuel, and also so that you employ the liver to do its job with gluconeogenesis and make more glucose. So that's one strategy. Don't take carbohydrate during some of your long runs. Another strategy is to alternate 2 workouts on one day and a rest day, 2 workouts on the next day and a rest day, rather than just train once a day. Another strategy is to do, if you don't want to do that extreme case of 2 workouts every other day, then at least a couple times a week, do 2 workouts on a given day, and don't eat a lot of carbohydrate or any carbohydrate in between those 2 runs. The fourth strategy is to do back-to-back long runs on consecutive days, and again, don't eat a lot of carbohydrate in between those 2 runs. So the second run that you have, the second long run, you're going to feel tired, you're going to come into it with a low carbohydrate, but that'll be very beneficial to really force the adaptation to be made. So there's 4 different strategies that you have to train with low carbohydrate to maximize how much glycogen that you can store. So if anybody's got a question, feel free to ask. I'm always happy to answer questions. Hope everyone had a good Halloween. I forgot to wear my Halloween mask. I had this really scary Halloween mask. Maybe you saw that. I posted it in my story. Very scary Halloween mask. So that's really all I want to say about low carbohydrate training. Not every show has to be that long. It's good to get a lot of information in a short period of time. That's what people love about social media, right? You get a lot of information in a very short period of time. So try that. Try. It may not feel good in the beginning, but try to run on low glycogen and see how you respond to that. And then subsequent to that, then you want to consume a lot of carbohydrate to give yourself the source that you need to store more. But at least try 1 or more of those 4 different strategies to lower the carbohydrate fuel tank so that you can maximize the adaptation. Okay, so at the end of every show, I like to give some thought of the day to leave you with, since it's going to be a week until I see you again. And so my thought for today is to use this time. We're still in a pandemic, almost 8 months later. It's amazing that we're still in a pandemic. This is going to go deep into next year, guys. So hunker down and get ready for this, because life is not going to get back to normal probably for at least another year. And so, we already know that Boston Marathon already is not, canceled April's race. So they're going to go virtual again or try to do it sometime later next year. So we're already seeing how this is going to go deep into next year already. So don't get down on yourself. Keep running, and think of this time as a chance to be creative and a chance to pursue ideas that you wouldn't normally pursue, especially like now with your training. You may as well try something. Just experiment on yourself, but experiment using scientific principles. Don't just do things arbitrarily. There's always science behind what you do, because your body is all science. And so try things based on the science, based on the research. Use this as a time, both in your running and outside of your running. Pursue ideas that you have. Everybody's got ideas. There are 7 billion people in the world. There are 7 billion people who have ideas. So use this as a time to pursue ideas, both with your training and in other areas of your life, in your work, in relationships, in other things that you do every day. Use this as an opportunity to pursue ideas that you wouldn't normally pursue. So that's my thought to leave you with for the day. So thank you for joining us. I hope you get a lot out of these episodes. This is like our 22nd or 23rd. I think it's our 23rd episode of this. We've been doing this for 23 weeks already. We'll keep going. If you have ideas that you want me to address, then please write in the comments, write ideas, and we'll address those comments. As I keep talking, I'm going to eventually run out of topics to talk about, so maybe I'll have guests on the show. So let me know if that's something you want to do. We can make this like a podcast and have guests on the show. But this is for you. I want to help you guys, and so you let me know what you want to hear, what you want me to talk about, and I'm happy to talk about all those things. If you want some great training programs for different races, go to my website, runfit.com, and there's a bunch of training programs on the website you can get, and you can always email me at jason@run-fit.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. So thank you for joining us again from our studios in Southern California. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Karp. This has been another episode of Run Talk. See you next week.